The strangest part wasn't that I changed. It was that no one noticed. Not my family. Not my friends. Not even me, at first. The change didn't arrive as a decision or a crisis. It arrived quietly, disguised as adaptation. I didn't wake up one day and choose to become someone else. I simply adjusted, a little here, a little there, until the person I used to be no longer fit inside my life. And I didn't resist. Because resistance is loud. What I was doing felt reasonable. I learned to soften opinions that caused friction. I learned to laugh at things that didn't feel funny. I learned to nod at ideas I didn't believe in and tell myself that disagreement wasn't worth the tension. I told myself this was maturity. I told myself I was growing. What I was actually doing was editing myself for survival. At first, those edits felt harmless. Necessary, even. You don't bring your full self everywhere, everyone knows that. You learn what parts to show and what parts to keep private. You learn when to speak and when to stay quiet. But slowly, the line blurred. I stopped noticing where adaptation ended and self-erasure began. I became good at reading rooms. Good at anticipating expectations. Good at being what people needed in the moment. Reliable. Calm. Reasonable. Predictable. People liked me. That should have felt reassuring. Instead, it felt strange. Like they liked a version of me that had been assembled carefully, piece by piece, to avoid inconvenience. I noticed how rarely anyone reacted strongly to me anymore. No conflict. No surprise. No real disagreement. Conversations stayed smooth, controlled, polite. I told myself that meant things were healthy. But health doesn't feel invisible. I started losing track of my own reactions. Someone would ask my opinion, and I'd pause, not because I didn't know how to answer, but because I didn't know which version of myself was supposed to respond. The honest one? The agreeable one? The safe one? Choosing felt exhausting. So I defaulted. Defaulted to what worked. Over time, my inner voice grew quieter. Not silent, just distant. Like a radio playing in another room. I could sense it was there, but I rarely listened closely enough to understand what it was saying. I mistook that distance for calm. I thought I had outgrown intensity. What I had actually outgrown was contact with myself. The most unsettling moments came when I was alone. Not lonely, alone. When there was no one to perform for, no expectations to meet, no version to maintain. I would sit there and feel nothing specific. No excitement. No urgency. No direction. Just a vague sense of being disconnected from my own life. I told myself it was normal. That adulthood was like this. That everyone eventually feels detached from who they used to be. That nostalgia was just resistance to growth. So I kept going. Days blended into weeks. Weeks into years. I stayed functional, productive, acceptable. My life looked stable from the outside, even successful in small, quiet ways. Inside, I felt like a guest. A polite observer in a life that no longer felt authored by me. The moment that scared me most came unexpectedly. Someone asked me a simple question, not philosophical, not deep: why do you like this? I opened my mouth to answer. And realized I didn't know. Not because I didn't like it. Because I hadn't checked in a long time. That realization landed heavily. I started asking myself uncomfortable questions after that. When was the last time I made a decision that felt intentional? When was the last time I disagreed out loud? When was the last time I surprised myself? The answers were vague. Incomplete. Distant. I understood then that I hadn't become someone new. I had become someone neutral. Easy to be around. Easy to approve of. Easy to overlook. And the most frightening part was this: no one was alarmed by it. Because I hadn't disappeared dramatically. I had faded politely. I wondered how long this had been happening. How many versions of myself I had quietly set aside in the name of being reasonable. How often I had chosen smoothness over truth without realizing it was a trade. I looked at my reflection one night and felt a flicker of recognition, not of who I was, but of who I wasn't anymore. That's when the thought arrived, uninvited and impossible to ignore: if I don't recognize myself, who exactly am I being for everyone else? That question didn't bring panic. It brought stillness. And in that stillness, I realized something terrifying and clear: I had become someone I didn't recognize. And no one had noticed. Once I admitted to myself that I didn't recognize who I had become, I couldn't go back to not seeing it. The realization didn't fade. It sharpened. I started noticing the gaps, moments where something should have been there and wasn't. Reactions that felt delayed. Opinions that felt borrowed. Choices that happened automatically, without any internal confirmation. I wasn't lying to anyone. That was the unsettling part. I was simply absent. I noticed how often I mirrored people without thinking. How easily my tone shifted depending on who I was with. How my preferences adjusted to avoid friction. It wasn't manipulation, it was survival learned so well it no longer felt like a skill. It felt like personality. I had become adaptable in a way that erased distinction. People trusted me because I was consistent. Calm. Reasonable. I rarely caused discomfort. I rarely took strong positions. I rarely disrupted anything. From the outside, that looked like maturity. From the inside, it felt like dilution. The internal breakdown didn't arrive with panic or tears. It arrived with disorientation. A growing sense that I was living on autopilot, not because I was overwhelmed, but because disengagement had become my default. I tried to remember when that had started. There was no single moment. It was a long accumulation of small compromises. Times I didn't correct someone because it wasn't worth it. Times I laughed instead of disagreeing. Times I accepted decisions I didn't like because pushing back felt unnecessary. Each compromise felt minor. Together, they rewrote me. I realized how often I had chosen to be easy instead of honest. How often I had equated being liked with being safe. How subtly I had trained myself to believe that my authentic reactions were negotiable. That belief had consequences. I felt it in my body before I could explain it in words. A low-level tension that never resolved. Fatigue that didn't come from effort but from restraint. A sense of being constantly present and never fully involved. I wasn't exhausted from doing too much. I was exhausted from holding myself back. The scariest moments came when I tried to access something real: anger, excitement, conviction, and felt how muted it was. As if the volume had been turned down years ago and never restored. I hadn't lost emotion. I had lost permission. Permission to feel strongly. To react honestly. To let something matter enough to risk conflict. That's when grief entered the picture. Not grief for a single loss, but for accumulated absence. For the version of me that used to care more intensely. That used to argue, dream, insist. That version hadn't been destroyed, just neglected. Neglect does quieter damage. I felt anger then, not outward, but inward. Anger at how willingly I had participated in my own erasure. How often I had told myself it was harmless to stay neutral. How deeply I had underestimated the cost of not showing up fully. I understood something painful and clarifying: I hadn't been changing. I had been shrinking. The moral dilemma became unavoidable. Do you stay as this version of yourself, agreeable, stable, unchallenging, because it works and no one complains? Or do you risk disruption by reclaiming parts of yourself that may no longer fit cleanly into your life? Staying felt easier. It required no explanations. No adjustments. No uncomfortable conversations. Everyone already knew how to interact with this version of me. Reclaiming myself felt risky. What if I didn't know who I was anymore? What if the parts one tried to bring back felt awkward, underdeveloped, out of place? What if people didn't like the person I became when I stopped editing myself? And perhaps the most frightening question: what if I didn't like them either? Because discovering who you are after years of self-erasure isn't romantic. It's destabilizing. I realized how much I had relied on external validation to define myself. How rarely I checked whether my life felt aligned internally. How easily I accepted approval as evidence that I was doing something right. Approval is seductive. It asks very little of you. But it gives you a self that belongs more to others than to yourself. I started noticing how invisible my discomfort had become, even to me. How quickly I dismissed it. How instinctively I rationalized it away. I had learned to mistrust my own internal signals because they threatened the smoothness of my life. That mistrust had consequences. I was living in a body that knew something was wrong while my mind kept insisting everything was fine. That split couldn't last forever. I began to understand that identity doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes through long periods of accommodation. Through choosing peace over truth often enough that truth loses its urgency. And once truth loses urgency, it becomes optional. I didn't want to live like that anymore. But wanting change isn't the same as choosing it. I stood at a quiet threshold then, not between two lives, but between comfort and honesty. Between continuing to function smoothly and risking the instability of becoming someone I hadn't been in a long time. I didn't know what the right choice was yet. But I knew this: staying unrecognizable to myself was no longer an option. Because the longer I lived as someone I didn't recognize, the harder it would be to remember who I was supposed to be. And time, I had learned, doesn't restore what you don't reclaim. The moment I tried to return to myself wasn't brave. It was clumsy. I didn't suddenly speak with confidence or reclaim some hidden, fully formed identity. I hesitated. I stumbled. I said things imperfectly and sometimes regretted the timing, the tone, the wording. But I said them. And that alone felt unfamiliar enough to be frightening. The first change wasn't external. It was internal permission. Permission to pause before agreeing. Permission to feel irritation without immediately dissolving it. Permission to ask myself, do I actually mean this, before opening my mouth? That pause changed everything. I realized how automatic my old responses had been. How often I had been answering before I even knew the question. Slowing down exposed how much of my life had been running on reflex instead of intention. The first time I disagreed out loud, my heart raced. Not because the disagreement was dramatic, but because it broke a pattern that had protected me for years. The room didn't react the way I had imagined. No one attacked me. No one rejected me outright. Some people looked surprised. Some adjusted. Some moved on quickly. The world didn't end. But something else did. The illusion that my silence was necessary. That illusion had kept me comfortable and invisible. Speaking disrupted that balance. It made things slightly messier, slightly less predictable. It also made them real. As I continued, I noticed resistance, both from others and from myself. People who were used to my neutrality needed time to recalibrate. A few seemed disappointed. Some pulled back subtly, as if unsure how to interact with this new version of me. That hurt. Because it confirmed something I had always feared: part of my acceptance had depended on my disappearance. Letting go of that acceptance felt like loss. But it also felt honest. I discovered that reclaiming myself didn't mean becoming louder or more intense. It meant becoming clearer. Choosing words that matched my thoughts. Allowing my reactions to exist without immediate correction. That clarity came with discomfort. I made mistakes. I overcorrected. Sometimes I spoke when silence would have been wiser. Other times I stayed quiet out of habit and noticed it afterward, frustrated with myself. Progress wasn't linear. But it was movement. The most surprising change happened when I was alone. Without the constant performance of being agreeable, my inner world slowly regained volume. I started noticing preferences again. Small ones at first. What I liked. What I didn't. What drained me. What held my attention. Those signals had always been there. I had just learned not to listen. I began making decisions that didn't make sense to everyone else. Choices that couldn't be explained neatly. Adjustments that disrupted routines I had mistaken for identity. Each one felt like stepping onto unstable ground. But instability, I learned, is not the same as danger. It's often the sign that something new is forming. I also felt grief more deeply than I expected. Grief for the years I had lived as a softer outline of myself. For the intensity one had muted. For the risks I hadn't taken because being acceptable felt safer than being honest. I didn't try to erase that grief. I let it exist. Because grief meant I was finally acknowledging the cost of my silence instead of pretending it hadn't mattered. I didn't become someone entirely different. I became someone less edited. That difference mattered. I noticed how my body felt when my words matched my thoughts, lighter, steadier, less tense. I noticed how fatigue changed quality. I was still tired sometimes, but not hollow. Effort felt cleaner when it wasn't spent suppressing myself. Some relationships didn't survive this shift. Not because I attacked or withdrew, but because they had relied on my neutrality to function. When I stopped being a mirror, there was nothing left holding them together. That loss hurt. But it also taught me something essential: if my presence only worked when I erased myself, then that presence had never been whole. Other relationships deepened in quieter ways. When I showed up imperfectly, uncertainly, without smoothing every edge, something unexpected happened. People responded to me, not to the version I had curated for safety. That felt unfamiliar. And worth learning. I understand now how easily identity can be lost without drama or trauma. It doesn't require catastrophe. It only requires long-term accommodation. A habit of choosing ease over truth. A belief that being low friction is the same as being mature. It isn't. Maturity isn't silence. It's discernment. It's knowing when peace is genuine and when it's just the absence of conflict purchased at your own expense. I still feel the pull to disappear sometimes. To smooth things over. To let things slide instead of speaking. Those habits were built over years. They don't vanish overnight. But now I recognize them. And recognition gives me a choice. I don't have to be loud to exist. I don't have to be difficult to be real. I don't have to be perfect to be present. I only have to stop editing myself out of my own life. If you're listening to this and something inside you feels unfamiliar, if you've adapted so well that you no longer know what's truly yours, I want you to know this: you didn't lose yourself because you were weak. You lost yourself because you were accommodating. And accommodation can be unlearned. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But moment by moment. Choice by choice. I became someone I didn't recognize. Finding my way back didn't require becoming someone new. It required stopping long enough to listen to the parts of me I had been silencing for years, and letting them speak, even when their voice shook. That's how I began to recognize myself again. Not suddenly. But honestly.